Today we're going to talk about casting in the wind, dealing with wind. It's something that intimidates most anglers, but the reality is a lot of the better fish, a lot of the harder to catch fish are going to be caught on windy days. Their guard is down, they're less prone to hear you, and you know, it's easier to get them to make a mistake. So if you can learn to cast in the wind, you're going to catch a lot more fish. Calm days are really hard to catch a lot of, harder to catch fish such as a permit or something like that. So with that in mind, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do to improve your casting into the wind. Obviously, one of the main things is you've got to learn to cast a relatively tight loop. You've got to get the aerodynamics, the shape of that loop, down from a big wide loop to something narrow that's more aerodynamic, directs the energy along a straighter path, and is going to make that fly turn over into that wind. How can you do that? For one, you need to use a fairly straight path of the rod tip. So the straighter you can move your hand and thus the rod tip, the tighter the loop's going to get. And then the other often overlooked part of that is to make a very sudden stop. It's not a matter of how fast you get the line going. It's a matter of how fast it's going when you come to a sudden stop. So if you get going really fast, the average person, what they try to do is punch it into the wind. You hear people say, punch that into the wind. Well, punching, to me at least, implies trying to accelerate up to it. And what that often leads to is an acceleration and then a deceleration before the stop, which is not going to go into the wind well. What you need to do is smoothly accelerate the line, accelerate your hand, accelerate the rod tip, accelerate the line, and then come to a very sudden, very abrupt stop. So the more abrupt you can make that stop, coming under control, making a nice smooth motion with a sudden stop, the better you're going to get that line to turn over into the wind. Other parts of that, you might use a longer casting stroke. Your hand moves through a longer motion through the cast in order to make that acceleration smoother and thus be able to still come under control and stop the rod. But at the same time, you don't want to widen the arc. You don't want to make your hand move through a big arc. You want to try to make it as long and as straight a movement with your hand as you can make it. Next, if you can deal with the trajectory, a lot of people casting into the wind have a back cast that goes down behind them, declines behind them, and then inclines into the wind. In other words, it goes up into the wind. No matter how good a cast you make, once that energy is done, or once your forward momentum of that cast is unrolled, it's got two things to deal with: gravity and the wind. So when you throw it high, gravity takes longer to get it to the water, and thus the wind has more time to blow it back at you. So you really want to make sure that when you're casting into the wind, that your back cast comes up at a steeper angle, throwing it higher in the back, and more descending then coming forward. So that once that line unrolls, it hits the water. Other things you can do: shorten your leader into the wind. That's obviously much harder to turn a fly over. There's no mass or not as much mass in that leader. You want to make that shorter so that it doesn't lose as much energy. And also a fly line that has a relatively shorter taper head length will also carry and turn over that fly better.